from the CyberHub bunker and studio. You're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast, Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
Well, folks, it's virtual RSA. And as much as I'd love to see all your ugly faces, this might be the last year we get to do this like this. Joining me on this part of Tech Corner for RSA, or special virtual RSA coverage, is Sergey Gulyayev. He is the COO over at Securedata. Sergey, cockdilla.
Fantastic, James. Pleasure to be here.
We got to learn, if you're in cyber and you don't know a little bit of Russian and Hebrew, you don't exist, right? Yeah. Like you go to RSA, you hear English, and then you hear Hebrew and Russian, and that's pretty much the conversation. Bring a little, San Francisco feel to the virtual playing field.
Excellent pronunciation.
Thank you. Хорошо. Спасибо большое. All right, folks. I've got an awesome session here today with Sergey. We're going to talk a little bit about, ransomware and backups and a problem that we thought we all got rid of, that COVID kind of brought back to our attention. We'll talk a little bit about what Securedata does, so don't miss out this session. You can go and subscribe, follow us right now on all your favorite podcast listening platform. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, turn on the notification bell. That way you'll get notified every time we post a video this week for the virtual RSA conference, the calling virtual experience, which, is all of within itself a little awkward because I'm used to seeing people. All right. So Sergey, a little bit about, I think the talk of the week, ransomware, right? And we've seen the year of COVID, we saw a 62% increase in ransomware across, the entire world. Multiple reports talk about it now becoming a $3-4 billion a year industry, with ransomware as a service essentially being accessible for anyone with any cybercrime desire. Let's focus a little bit on that cyber element of it. There's one aspect of ransomware that helps you recover quickly, which is cold storage backup. Why is it difficult for a lot of organizations to go down the path of cold storage and backup?
I think it's the size of the data. The cybersecurity infrastructure is meant to keep the entire network safe, and that network is generally generating a lot of data on the back end. Could be hundreds of terabytes, could be a petabyte of data. Keeping something like that's production data and cold storage presents a big challenge for organizations. So it's about making sure the critical infrastructure, critical files are protected so systems can be up and running right away. So that's what we see, and this is what we try to help organizations solve.
So let's talk a little bit about cold storage in the event of a ransomware attack. What's the advantage of it? How practical really is it, Sergey? Because one of the things about cold storage is it's a manual process. So the cost of it, the duration of it is more complex. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. This is essentially what the challenge is. So with cold storage, it is a manual process. It can be automated in places, but the importance of it, and this is essentially FBI's best practices, because they do release a lot of case studies and they publish papers about what the procedure should be in recovering from ransomware. Offline storage can help in many ways. In essence, it's completely disconnected from the internet. So if the whole network gets affected, the domain controllers, the systems get affected, the cold storage isn't connected to anything. So it won't be affected by the ransomware attack that happened. And from the process of restoring, again, if the critical systems are offline, and there could be several terabytes of infrastructure critical data, they can be booted off of, depending on what it is. So let's say a hard drive. So if it's an offline encrypted disk, it can be connected to another server, and all of the data could be there. And it could be synced almost in real time. Of course, backing up terabytes and terabytes or hundreds of terabytes or a petabyte of data in real time, it's not only impractical, it's very cost prohibitive, and most organizations won't consider that as an option. But keeping just the vital data backed up and ready to go in an accessible place, that's the best solution to kind of mitigating ransomware. Even though it may not be prevented, it can be contained, mitigated, and the downtime can be minimal implementing offline storage strategy.
So you said a few very smart things here. One is it's very hard to stop ransomware. I think the conversations around ransomware need to be had in a very different fashion, right? That we need to have the conversations around ransomware in a whole as being more of a one, how do we increase recovery? So you talked a little bit about cold storage being and being a critical part of it. How do you really, do cold storage on scale? Which I think is a bigger challenge for a lot of people, is the idea of I've got so many different business applications that are critical to my business. How do I start to pick and choose? Because you could be talking about terabytes worth of data that, that can't be something that's, simple and cheap to do for an organization. And how often do you recommend doing it?
Well, us being in the data recovery business, we suggest that you do follow the 3-2-1 backup rules strictly. So that one last portion of it being offline content, but it's 3 copies of your production data in 2 separate environments, one offsite being that offsite content, preferably encrypted. From a perspective of how do you scale it, it all depends on the systems and the infrastructure the organization has. If it's, again, infrastructure systems which are critical to maintaining the mission critical systems, those need to be backed up incrementally, hopefully daily. And I know that's, again, depending on the scale, most of the time you may have different data centers, you may have different locations, but the thing that runs the business, the systems that run the business without which it's completely frozen, those need to be backed up almost in real time at all times. As far as the data that it produces, that, of course, generally is a much larger data set. And again, hopefully the systems are in place when ransomware attack does occur. Right away, it will go after the infrastructure, but the data itself, it takes a long time to encrypt. So that can be stopped, paused, and essentially the data doesn't really need to be, the data set itself doesn't really need to be stored in real time. But the systems that operate, they need to be stored in real time.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, this kind of goes to the concept of how do you do, cold storage on inherently systems that are built in a cloud environment? What are some of the best practices around that to really ensure? Because a lot of times people trust the data center to do their cold storage backup. And, if a fire happens and their cold storage, it's stored in the same facility where your stuff is stored. Like we saw what happened in Germany a few months back where the data center went on fire. People had their backups stored there and their backups were lost as part of the fire as well. How do you kind of, deal and what are some of the best practices around really doing data backup in the cloud today, which is a different process than on-prem?
Yeah, so with that, you want to have multiple co-locations. So as we noticed, there was major fires in Europe for data centers. So having an offsite data storage means just that, it's offsite. So even if you have a data set in the cloud, you want to be pulling that off to an on-premise location, even though it is going to take time and it is challenging depending on the amount of data. But the only way to ensure continuity of business is if you aren't affected by a natural event or natural disaster event or some event directly on that location. You want to have either a multi-failover, so multiple locations having the same exact data, but again, keeping it somewhere safe and secure offsite is part of that strategy. And I totally understand and kind of sympathize with the modern organizations that have vast amounts of data that say it's very impractical to pull that much data offline. But if, again, you want to ensure business continuity and total security from a standpoint of not being affected by a natural disaster in one place or power outage in one place, you have to have multiple locations. It's unavoidable.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's talk a little bit about a problem I thought we had solved. It was gone. We all slept well because it was one challenge on security we all got rid of. And it's the USB port, right? I think the last time RSA really had a conversation around USB security was 2015-16. Since then, there's been very little talk around it because really it's a kind of like a IT security best practice, right? Disable all USB ports unless otherwise. And if you're going to enable USB, do it in a sandbox, meaning make sure that USB ports are connecting through a VPN, a piped VPN to a sandbox to some sort of VM. You sandbox, the USB, you open it, you make sure that it's not malicious, and then you allow it into your network. COVID came, changed the whole outlook on business. A lot of companies disabled USB ports. Some companies allow people to use their own laptops from home, which had USB ports open. People are buying webcams, mics, trying to get professional Zoomers, as I call them, right? And that's kind of opened the door again to security of USB ports. How have you seen that translate over the last, 12, 14 months?
I think you just described it. So with COVID hits, a lot of the workforce was remote. So majority of the things that IT personnel believed that they solved through robust infrastructure security became a wide open gap again, because people have their own computers, they have their own laptops, even if they're deployed and a corporate laptop is deployed for personal use. That essentially loses the control of the administrator being, able to control where they're connecting to and seeing, kind of how they're using it day to day. It's completely remote. So USB ports became a big issue. So the way we combat that here is, of course, having a DLP solution, which allows the administrator to remotely control the policy of either making sure that USB ports are blocked and enforcing that policy, or allowing only certain encrypted devices to be used. In addition, of course, there's different manufacturers of webcams, which again, and mice and keyboards. DLP solutions can control human interface devices and allow the administrator to kind of regulate what brand is allowed, or maybe disable human interface devices at all from webcams and certain manufacturers. So that's a problem that resurfaced, and a lot of organizations weren't thinking about it. They thought it was in their rearview mirror, but essentially it's resurfaced in a big way. And I don't think anybody could have predicted just how important it is going to be, again, to manage USB policy in remote environments or even in an organizational environment. So there's, again, the only way to combat that is, as you said, either no USBs, but then you have to have some policy enforcement mechanism for that, such as a DLP solution, or you allow the users to do that, and then you restrict or whitelist only certain USB devices that can be plugged into those devices.
So, one of the key buzzwords for this year's RSA is the passwordless movement. Mm-hmm. The idea that you don't need passwords anymore. And in some cases, they're using these USB devices that authenticate users, which is kind of bringing back this whole security on USB ports. Eventually, we're going to go back to normal. Next year, I hope, Sergey, you and I will be having a beer while we do this at RSA, right? Or a whiskey or a bourbon, much preferable, right? But we're gonna be having a drink and talking about it, and someone's gonna be out there at RSA handing out USB sticks as their swag. Mm-hmm. And so here's the thread all over again. What do you think is a sustainable long-term solution to this USB challenge going forward, especially when you look at the USB-C, for example, on Macs, which really create a whole new set of challenges because they don't take a typical USB. You've got to get an adapter, and you and I both know the more tech you add, the more complexities get into the supply chain. How do you start addressing those as well? And what's the future look like?
That's a great question, and that's something we think a lot about here. So I think employee education is the number one thing. So making sure users are being educated not to accept swag that they pick up at a show and then do the first thing, plug it into their corporate environments or plug it into a corporate laptop. Beyond that, of course, DLP control. So DLP solutions will allow administrators to enforce strict policies about the types of devices that can be put on. And again, that's going to alleviate a lot of the headache, but that's essentially the two things you can do. Short of snapping off the USB ports physically with pliers, not much else that you can do from that standpoint. We have seen that as well. That's the reason I bring that up.
You've seen people actually snap USB ports with pliers?
With pliers, all across the organization, because they're hyper secure, hyper vigilant. So something that can be accomplished with a piece of software which is installed, some IT administrators have a background that calls for a more direct approach.
I will tell you that when I used to travel a lot, when I traveled to countries where I didn't trust their airport security, and let's say I had to travel with my laptop, which I try not to, I have a burner laptop just for that travel. I put pieces of tape over my USB ports, and then I draw a pattern on the tape. So when they're running my laptop through security, there's no way for them to try to, plug in. There's some countries that are very sophisticated with how they want to extract data from your devices. So I always put like little tape, and I can tell if it's been tampered with and so forth. It's
that's also a crude way of doing it, but effective. I can imagine nobody's going to be able to rip that tape off, replace it with the same pattern you drew. So that's kind of physical security. Very creative. Very creative.
I love it. Yeah, I hate the fact that the USB problem is back. As a CISO, I despise the fact that I thought I had this problem contained. It was one less thing I had to worry about. Not anymore. As we kind of wrap up our show, talk a little bit about how Securedata has transformed over the last, 5-6 years. Because up until about 2016, my knowledge of Securedata was you guys were mostly data recovery, right? Data backup and recovery. You guys have really transformed. Talk a little bit about that journey.
Yes, we did. The world changes. The amount of data being created and stored is just mounting every single year. Our roots are from data recovery. So essentially, we were the organization to call when you had a problem, a data breach, or was a virus attack, or a user error, or maybe just a system failure. And we pivoted away from being just a data recovery and forensic company, slowly moving into products. We started out with file repair, allowing users to repair damaged files. We have a suite which does 44 major titles. Majority of them are Office related. If there's a sudden corruption, users can upload an affected file, and we do the repair magic in the cloud. Right away, they download a recovered file they can use right away. And then moving into the security space of physical products. So 2016, we kind of started looking at the idea of how do we securely return the recovered data back to customers. And our idea was hardware encrypted external drives. So what we wanted to solve is issues around speed of transfer, because some software solutions, there's a lot of free software which will do a pretty good job of encrypting your data. So when you send it through the mail, through the courier, it's protected. But it created a lot of bloat around our process because, us being a production-based recovery company, we're transferring a massive amount of data on a daily basis. And the fastest way to do that is through USB ports and hardware encryption. So what we have is a line of FIPS validated drives and USB and external disk format. And those can be used to store as much as 16 terabytes in a single disk with SSD read and write speeds. And they have the ability to be remotely managed. So a very unique functionality is for them to be remotely managed through a mobile app and a combination of a cloud-based software. So it's a very unique offering. We see, again, as you mentioned, USBs kind of almost were phased out, but COVID did bring back a lot of the necessity to travel with private and confidential data, as well as move it around between locations. And we see that there's going to be a need for it for the foreseeable future. And we would like to provide the robust ecosystem of DLP solution, hardware encrypted storage with built-in antivirus, as well as the ability to remotely manage it as our Securedata solution.
Brilliant. Perfect. So what are you guys doing? Anything special for RSA? Are you guys part of the show? You guys staying virtual this year? What are some of the things you guys are doing around RSA that people can connect with?
I think, as you mentioned, this will be the last year we're doing the virtual kind of interaction before we start attending in person, just to kind of let everything settle down as far as the world events around COVID. And past that, I think we'll be participating again in physical form. They are a lot of fun. We really enjoy them. We enjoy meeting with the industry personnel. We enjoy the speakers, and the overall activity around RSA is just, it's great.
Brilliant. Sergey, thank you so much for coming on the program. Thank you for sharing everything with us today. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Securedata for your support of the RSA virtual experience here at the CyberHub podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you, James.
All right, folks. That's it. More content coming to you every few hours this week. Every few hours, something new. So make sure you go to our YouTube channel, subscribe, turn on the notifications. You'll get it. Also go follow the CyberHub podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform, whether it be Apple, Spotify, Google, iHeartRadio, and all the other ones. You'll find all this great content there under our RSA Virtual RSA Experience 2021. That's it for us here, folks. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for listening. And we'll be back with more later. Cheers.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.